So recently I finally beat Cuphead by 300%ing the game to its absolute perfection. And when I mean perfection, I mean I got all the achievements for both the original game and the DLC. I striked every single boss even when it wasn't required, and I randomized my weapons because I wanted to feel something. But of course, being the challenge-driven lunatic that I was, it wasn't enough to quench my thirst for more. Which is why in this video, I'm gonna attempt to beat the entire game again, but this time without dying a single time. And if I do end up dying at any point in the challenge, I gotta quit out of the game to start all over again. Oh, and did I mention I'm gonna do it all in under 24 hours? I need help. Will I manage to defeat all 31 bosses without a single death on expert mode before the time runs out, or will I let the pressure get to me and throw the game at the very end? Stick around to the end to find out. With that said, let's get right into the video. Now, like all classic run and gun games, we have to first pick a character, where in this case, it's between Cuphead and Mugman. And for those of you who've watched my previous videos, I'm not quite fond of Cuphead in the least bit, since he tried to gamble away our souls to the devil like a gullible beta cup he is. So ever since then, Mugman's been the star of my videos, and what can I say? I'm biased towards the color blue, for obvious reasons. However, I feel like it's time we give Cuphead a second chance in life and let him redeem himself as he becomes the star of this video. Is what I would say, but we're switching to Chalice later on, so never mind. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is talk to the old kettle to give us the power to turn our fingers into a gun. Then we go through the tutorial to grab this coin, speak to the apple with the hole in his head to grab another 3. Seriously bro, get that checked out. And with the coins we've gathered, we're gonna buy the heart charm as our first item. Reason being that we need to survive long enough to reach Inkwell Isle 4 to switch out our character for Miss Chalice, who in turn will greatly increase our chances to successfully complete this challenge with her invincible dodge rolls, double jumps, and an extra heart. With that said, let's jump right into our first run and gun challenge. Now, despite the hours of time I've spent playing this game, the run and gun maps felt like the easiest ones to die to. Mostly because there are so many random things out to get you, and sometimes they clump at a bad time and you just can't get out of it. But since I didn't have to do the pacifist run this time, I just had to gun down the mobs in front of me to easily complete the map, even though I almost failed my first attempt. After completing the first run and gun map, I crossed the bridge to head towards the mausoleum to parry off some ghosts to obtain my first super art. Then I got on the boat to travel all the way to Inkwell Isle 4, spoke with the chef who's gonna turn evil later on to obtain the astral cookie to use Miss Chalice, and then gathered all the coins I could in town before proceeding to climb up the ladder to take on the King of Games champions. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Now, usually you can only fight the first 2 champions and then you have to beat one of the DLC bosses to take on the rest. But turns out you can actually skip it by using this glitch where you immediately pull up the options screen to retry the fight. And by doing that, I was able to fight all the champions in one go. As for how the fights went down, the only thing you have to do against these guys is parry them. So most of them are quite easy to beat as long as you have a decent level of reaction speed and good timing. Both of which I clearly had at the time, as you can tell by my exquisite gaming prowess. But all jokes aside, even with a bit of rustiness, I still made it through eventually and headed back to the overworld to spend all the money I got so far. Hey buddy, long time no see. Did you miss me?
No.
Oh come on, not even a little?
No.
Not even a teeny weeny itty bitty little tiny bit? Just letting you know, you'd be starving and living in the streets without my patronage. Alright, so we bought a lot of things from the ungrateful piggy, but the ones we'll be using most of the time will be the crack shed, as it's the best homing weapon in the game, and the charge for the burst damage. As for the rest, I'll just play it by ear. Anyways, now that I had Miss Chalice and the items I needed to effectively use against my foes, I went back to Inkwell Isle 1 to begin my conquest to defeat every boss one by one, starting with Goopy Legrand. Oh, and by the way, if you're wondering what this little red line is, it's actually another glitch I found where you can immediately fight all the bosses on expert mode. And to do it, you first go into your completed game, change the difficulty to expert on one of the boss fights, and bada bing bada boom, you can skip the regular mode and go straight to expert. An absolute necessity of a glitch to help me save a ton of time, especially since I already wasted like an hour or 2 beating all the bosses on regular mode before finding out about this, which made me want to rage quit out of the challenge and never freaking play this game ever freaking again. Anyways, moving on. Now, Goopy here is known to be the easiest one to beat, mostly due to his incredibly predictable movement patterns and an attack sequence that even a 3-year-old could pick up on them. And to be frank, the only thing I had to worry about was... well, basically nothing, because he really wasn't that hard. But the next boss was absolutely... yeah, the root packs were pretty easy as well. Okay, now this is where the difficulty actually ramped up a bit. With Ruby and Croaks, I usually don't have a problem getting past their first 2 phases, especially since I had the crack shot to take care of the burning fireflies so I could focus on dodging. But the last phase with the slot machine was where I usually messed up the most, since I had to perfectly time my dodges against these 3 insanely fast-paced platform attacks. At one point in the fight, I actually forgot that Miss Chalice's first super art shot vertically and completely whiffed my timing and got close to dying. But thankfully, I was focused enough to keep evading its relentless attacks and pull through at the end. The next boss was Hilda, and I'm gonna be honest with you, I was not looking forward to fighting her. And that's because every one of her phases included an insane amount of projectile attack. Like seriously, how much more things can you fit in the screen? Nevertheless, even with all the things she threw at me, I still did pretty well against her now that I knew exactly what to expect. And what I mean by this is, for the longest time, I thought these UFOs attacked at a random interval. But turns out the brown ones had a delay and the red one shot right as I got under it. So all I had to do was stay back when the brown brown UFOs got close, shrink myself to get past the red ones, and keep this up until I got the dub. Then I had to fight with Cagney Carnation, who kinda seemed like a lot to deal with, but in reality he's fairly easy to beat. The only thing I had to do was constantly decimate his floating plants with my crack shot, do a little bobbing and weaving to dodge the boomerang and seed attacks, and avoid the rising vines along with the dandelions to easily take him out. After beating Cagney, I grabbed the hidden coin behind the trees and headed towards the next island. Now so far I was 6 hours into the game because believe it or not, I actually had to restart the run over and over again because I died in the most embarrassing of ways. But now that I was gonna face even harder bosses on the next island, the nerves were definitely kicking in real fast. Then again, seeing that I was doing pretty well this time around, I tried not to let it get to me and continued on to take on the next 5 bosses in Inkwell Isle 2. Upon arrival, I had 3 bosses to choose from, which were Baroness von Bonbon, followed by Beppy the Clown, and lastly Jimmy the Great. My thought process was whether I should first take on the hardest boss out of the 3 or save the worst for last and deal with the easier one first so I can hold on to hope for just a little bit longer. But then I realized that if I were to die to the harder bosses later on, that was gonna waste a ton of time. So with that logic, I took on the boss I hated the most, which was Bonnie. Now taking on Bonnie as my first opponent had me tense up a little bit, since every time I fought her, I usually get my tuchus handed to me. And I don't mean the first few phases where she sends out the mini bosses who are relatively easy to handle, but it's because of these heads of hers that annoyingly chases you down, which for some odd reason makes me want to clench my butt cheeks every single time as I try and avoid them, all the while being mindful of Patsy the mental over here. But even then, I was determined to stay alive and triumph over all the things she threw at me, and whatever happens, I knew I was gonna make it if I died. Why am I so bad? Anyways, on my 4th attempt, I got away with just losing 1 of my HP to her, got the win over the Candy Queen, and pray to God I don't die to the next few bosses. The next boss I went for was Beppy the Clown, and she was yet another boss who I just couldn't do all that well against because of her last phase that was equally full of projectiles similar to that of Bonnie. The only difference between the two was that they didn't home in on you, but there were significantly more I had to dodge. I actually did pretty well against her first 3 phases as I still had all 4 of my HP, but that number dwindled in a blink of an eye when I got to the last phase. I genuinely thought I wasn't gonna make it, but thanks to my last minute decision to take out the 2 penguins on the right side, I had a lot less baseballs to dodge. And with a little bit of X moves, I barely make it out alive. Once I beat Beppy, I decided to go with Wally Warbles next, as he was the last of the 3 I usually didn't do too well against. The first 3 phases were alright, as I just had to stay in a certain spot to keep the eggshells from hitting me, avoid the feather attacks by, well, just moving up and down. It really isn't that hard, and slide in and out of the openings of the eggs as they expanded and condensed, along with parrying his electric bullets. But it was when I got to Wally's last phase where things started going south, as I got dangerously close to dying when I first lost my HP to this bullet, followed by a dumb little mistake I made right here. Nevertheless, I still got away with the dub by the skin of my teeth. After that was the Jimmy, and I gotta say, I was super lucky to have met with the easiest version of his first phase with the blades coming out of the chest compared to the other 2 that would have completely whittled down my HP. And then the rest of the phases gets a lot easier, as most of what came next required little to no effort at all, since I just had to cheese the rest by bombing him from the top for the second phase, do the same on the 3rd phase, and lastly use my super bomb at the end to take him out. With Wally, Beppy, the Jimmy, and Bonnie out of the equation, the only thing left to do for this island was to beat Grim Matchstick and the 2 run and gun maps. And since I knew I was gonna wipe the floor with the dragon, I decided to get the run and gun maps out of the way first. Now, while the run and guns were comparatively less difficult than the boss fights, I still wanted to do everything I can to be as careful as possible. And funny enough, there's actually a hack the devs added to the game where if you repeatedly walk in a circle, you're granted 3 wishes to double your HP. And since I could only use it 3 times and there were still 4 running guns I needed to complete, I finished the one I was least likely to die first and then used the hack on the riskier map. Now you might be wondering, but Dan, if you can use a broken hack like that, wouldn't it be better to use it on a boss instead? And the answer to that is absolutely, but unfortunately the game didn't allow it. Maybe it's got something to do with the glitch I used to skip the regular mode, but apparently the hack didn't carry over to any of my boss fights. But that's alright, because I was still glad I could just use it at all. Anyways, after getting those done, I proceeded to defeat Grimmy, went around the carnival to make sure I didn't miss any hidden coins, then made my way over to the entrance that led to the next island. Now at this point in the game, I had around 3 hours left, mostly due to the several resets I had to do from the many deaths that ensued against the big 3 I usually had the hardest time beating. But now that I finally got past it, I actually went on to beat every single one of the bosses in the 3rd island without any issues at all, except for when I got too cocky and almost died to Calamaria. But other than that, the rest went swimmingly well, as you can tell by how much HP I still had left for every one of my battles. In fact, even my match against Dr. Cal, that most would say is revered as one of the toughest ones to overcome, was a cakewalk for me, as I beat him with with all 4 of my HP intact. As for King Dice and the Devil, they're known to be unironically too easy as the final 2 bosses in the game, so I don't think it's even worth mentioning them at this point. And believe it or not, doing all this only took me around an hour, including other miscellaneous tasks like completing the last 2 run and gun maps, buying off more stuff from Porcrine to keep him from ending up in the streets, and ghost busting the heck out of the last mausoleum to obtain my final super art that I won't be using at all. And just like that, with 2 hours left on the clock, it was now the final stretch of the challenge, and I felt absolutely ecstatic over the fact that I only had 6 more bosses to go to finish things once and for all. So with that said, I picked the Moonshine Mob as my first opponent. The first phase of the fight went exactly how I wanted, as using the crack shot obliterated everything in my path. Then came the second phase where I began to fumble the ball a little due to a couple of dodge rolling mishaps. But thanks to the shield I put up on the second mistake, I still had 3 HP going into the third phase. However, for some odd reason, I started choking where I failed to dodge the first scuffle the anteater shot out, followed by an immediate dash to another one, putting me at 1 HP. I could have panicked right here and lost it all, but instead I saw that I was close to fully charging out my special move. So I hung in there long enough until I eventually got my shield up, made sure to not get faked out by the premature knockout, and used my charge to finish the job. Up next was Glumstone the Giant, who I initially thought was going to be slightly easier to deal with than the previous boss, but then I jinxed myself by losing an HP to this gnome, followed by a couple more mistakes made in the second phase. However, once I got used to the timing of the puppets throwing the ball, the only thing I had to worry about was to keep my eye on the gnomes that sprung out of the ground, as well as making sure I shut down the ones that ended up in the air. After that, the rest went pretty well, since all I had to do was shift around the platforms to not fall into the acid pool, dodge a few projectiles here and there, and eventually let my crack shot slowly burn through the tumor's HP to get that knockout. The third boss I chose to fight was Mortimer Freeze, and much like my fight with Glumstone, I started out by making dumb mistakes one after the other, where I had to move on to the second phase with only 2 HP. And just when I thought I could try and keep myself alive with the heart shield, I not only lose it right away, but then lose another one to the blades rising up, which led me to go into the third phase dangerously low. I didn't know if I had it in me to get through the last phase with just 1 HP, but somehow I managed to survive long enough to fully charge my super meter to gain a heart shield, tank the laser eyeball, and eventually won the battle. Then came the fight against the Howling Aces, and quite frankly, I had no problem getting through the first and second phase. And that's because most of the attack patterns were pretty straightforward, and the part with the flying puppies is probably the easiest section of the entire game. However, seeing that I still had 4 health going into the last phase, I unfortunately let my guard down, which then had me begin to throw the match. But even though I was at 1 HP, I had my super meter filled up already, and by gaining another heart, I didn't have to worry about dying in 1 hit, which then allowed me to start playing more confidently, leading to my victory. After that, it was time to take it to the skies against Esther Winchester, who in my opinion was the scariest boss out of the ones I've faced so far due to the crazy amount of projectiles she had up her sleeves for every one of her phases. But thankfully, once you get past the first 2 phases, there's a way to cheese the third one by staying in this one spot where you're basically free from harm's way, until an occasional cannon beam zooms towards you, in which case I made sure to move out of the way. But other than that, I used my super bomb to dish out a ton of damage in the final phase, then beautifully weave through the sausage links to secure the dub. With the last ingredient gathered, I could finally see the finish line, where all that's left was to beat Chef Saltbaker to complete this challenge. The start of the fight wasn't the best, as I got consecutively hit 3 times in a row in the first phase, which meant I had to go into the second phase with only 1 HP and a shield. But despite the incredibly unfavorable situation, by renewing my shield every time I got hit, I survived through the entire ordeal, finishing off the chef at the very end. However, just when I thought it was all over and done with, I still had 7% left to go from 300%ing the game. And that's when I realized that I had completely forgotten to turn the broken relic I bought at the shop to the cursed relic, which meant I had to solve the cemetery puzzle to beat the secret boss, and then go through all 6 of the bosses again on regular mode. But the real issue lies with the cursed relic, since equipping it reduces my HP to 1 and it randomizes my entire loadout every time I dashed or released the shoot button. On top of that, since it was a charm, I had to unequip the astral cookie, which meant I couldn't use Miss Chalice's double jumps and dodge rolls anymore. The only way for me to increase my chances of successfully making it through this predicament was to use the heart ring effect from the cursed relic, which is basically one of the charms that is built into the relic that helps you gain 1 HP for every 1st, 3rd, and 7th parries you pull off. But even then, since I was gonna start every fight with 1 HP, I was still faced with the risk of dying in 1 hit. And because of this, I began to think whether I even had it in me to continue on, knowing that a single hit could spell the end of this very last attempt. But to have come this far only to let this major setback result in my downfall made me think about how glorious it was gonna be when I do succeed. And even if I fail, it would only mean that I was never good enough to attempt this challenge in the first place, so I couldn't afford to let it end knowing that my reputation as a gamer was on the line. It was down to the last 20 minutes where I had to heighten all my senses to their utmost limit to get through every one of the bosses once more. Despite being a single hit away from death multiple times, I did my absolute best not to die in the beginning phases of all my fights, surviving long enough to gain an extra heart anytime the opportunity presented itself. myself. But that wasn't enough to dispel the unfathomable amount of pressure I felt at the time, which led to several mistakes made along the way. But even with the numerous slip-ups, I still managed to push through with a bit of luck, eventually beating the first 5 bosses to get to the chef. The start of the fight went in my favor as I parried the pink sugar cube to gain an extra life. I then proceeded to elude my way through the vast bombardment of attacks the chef threw at me, encountering a few close calls in the process. Once I got through the first phase, it was now time to take on the pepper shakers. And as soon as the phase began, I managed to gain another heart, which made me think that I was now guaranteed to win. But how naive was I to let that get to me, as I immediately lost a life to a peppercorn followed by another to the falling leaf. Seeing that my super meter was full, I wrestled with the thought of whether I should use my super art at the time to momentarily alleviate my situation, but then decided to hold on to it as I saw the second phase was coming to an end. The third phase was where I could catch a short break, since I just had to make sure not to mess up my timing as the dancing salt figures bounced around the screen. And by keeping it up, the salt figures eventually fell, setting the stage for me to enter the final phase. The pressure was on as I was now inches away from completing the challenge, and with the burning determination to close out the match, I elevated my gameplay by perfectly timing my jumps on the descending platforms as well as parrying the chef's hearts like my life depended on it. But despite playing my absolute best, I ended up whiffing on this next jump. Could this be it? Was this the end of the line? Just when I was about to accept my impending doom, I looked over at the bottom corner of my screen, realizing that I have yet to use the super art I saved a while ago. And by activating it just in the nick of time, I escaped the clutches of death and finished up the rest of the battle with a triumphant knockout. And just like that, this challenge comes to a close as I now had yet another 300% game under my belt, but this time without a single death along the way. And just to appease the minds of the doubters out there, I made sure to go back to the second island where you can speak to this guy in the lake to check how many times you've died. And as you can see, it's a big fat 0. As always, hope you guys enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed playing. Be sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on all the awesome content I have planned for the future. As for me, I'm just gonna have a staring contest with the guy in the lake, and I will see you all in the next one.